8. Immanuel Kant. Immanuel Kant, 1724 to 1804, not only acknowledged his debt to Rousseau, but also hung Rousseau's picture on his study wall and declared that Rousseau was the Newton of the moral world. This moral primacy belonged to Rousseau because he had made man the new absolute of the universe. God might exist, and he might be a beautiful character, but he was no longer primary or even relevant in Rousseau's universe. Kant gave philosophical props to Rousseau's position. For Kant, God and all those unknown things in themselves are noumena, whose reality need neither be affirmed nor denied, and who are not a part of the realm of knowledge. Philosophy had worked to this point to eliminate the a priori. Now, with Kant, it was ready to introduce a new a priori, since both spiritual and material substances had been eliminated from the realm of valid knowledge, and only the mind of autonomous man left. The a priori could now be relocated firmly in man's reasoning without any reference to God. Man could now have knowledge, but he did not need God for this new kind of Kantian knowledge. Kant's concern was a system based on no data except reason itself, and which therefore seeks, without resting on any fact, to unfold knowledge from its original germs. Kant thus sought a new foundation for knowledge, one neither dependent on spiritual or material substances, nor dependent either on God or on sense impressions as representations of things in themselves. Kant was working towards cutting the umbilical cord which bound man to God and the universe. Kant's new a priori involved a new conception of what is universally and necessarily true. Pure mathematics, and especially pure geometry, can only have objective reality on condition that they refer to objects of sense. But, in regard to the latter, the principle holds good that our sense representation is not a representation of things in themselves, but of the way in which they appear to us. Hence, it follows that the propositions of geometry are not the results of a mere creation of our poetic imagination, and that therefore they cannot be referred with assurance to actual objects, but rather that they are necessarily valid of space, and consequently of all that may be found in space, because space is nothing else than the form of all external appearances, and it is this form alone in which objects of sense can be given. Sensibility, the form of which is the basis of geometry, is that upon which the possibility of external appearance depends. Therefore, these appearances can never contain anything but what geometry prescribes to them. It would be quite otherwise if the senses were so constituted as to represent objects as they are in themselves, but then it would not by any means follow from the conception of space, which, with all its properties, serves to the geometer as an a priori foundation, together with what is thence inferred, must be so in nature. The space of the geometer would be considered a mere fiction, and it would not be credited with objective validity, because we cannot see how things must of necessity agree with an image of them, which we make spontaneously and previous to our acquaintance with them. But if this image, or rather this formal intuition, is the essential property of our sensibility, by means of which alone objects are given to us, and if this sensibility represents not things in themselves, but their appearances, we shall easily comprehend and, at the same time, indisputably prove that all external objects of our world of sense must necessarily coincide in the most rigorous way with the propositions of geometry, because sensibility, by means of its forms of external intuition, that is to say, by space, the same with which the geometer is occupied, makes those objects at all possible as mere appearances. This remarkable passage, like every work of Kant's on knowledge, makes it clear that it was not Kant's concern to save knowledge. Rather, Kant followed after Hume in seeking the destruction of historic rationalism and empiricism, because they were still linked to God and to things in themselves. In their place, Kant sought to introduce a new kind of knowledge, together with a new kind of rationalism, as well as a new kind of empiricism. Space and time were, for Kant, mental realities rather than either illusions or objective realities. My doctrine of the ideality of space and of time, therefore, far from reducing the whole sensible world to mere illusion, is the only means of securing the application of one of the most important cognitions, that which mathematics propounds, a priori, to actual objects, of preventing its being regarded as mere illusion. Kant thus espoused a transcendental or critical idealism. My idealism concerns not the existence of things, the doubting of which, however, constitutes idealism in the ordinary sense, since it never came into my head to doubt it, but it concerns the sensuous representation of things to which space and time especially belong. It never came into my head to doubt the existence of things, Kant said. Then why the systematic separation of knowledge from things in themselves? Again, the answer is that God is bypassed thereby, and the autonomous mind of man is enthroned as the fountainhead of a new kind of knowledge and science, one which a priori rejects God insofar as any necessary connection to knowledge is concerned. Kant said, therefore, the understanding does not derive its laws a priori from, but prescribes them to nature. For Calvin, God is the source and principle of the interpretation of all things. For Kant, the autonomous mind of man is the source and principle of the interpretation of all things and of the laws of being. A Kantian interpretation of religion is thus inescapably and radically humanistic. Having first replaced God with nature, Enlightenment man was now replacing nature with man. The old metaphysics was thus as obsolete for Kant in the face of his critique as alchemy is in relationship to chemistry. A new quote-unquote objectivity was claimed by Kant, not what the mind of God has decreed, but what the mind of man reveals a priori as the objective truth. In Kant's words, we shall be rendering a service to reason should we succeed in discovering the path upon which it can securely travel. This path must exclude God, of course, and reason's dependence on things in themselves. Where God is concerned, I have found therefore it necessary to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith. Instead of being made complementaries, faith and knowledge are given separate domains, so that faith by definition is not grounded on, nor a form of knowledge. Knowledge must be purged of God, and it must also be purged of any necessity of corresponding with objective reality, with things in themselves. Only then is it pure. If therefore we seek to discover how pure concepts of understanding are possible, we must inquire what are the a priori conditions upon which the possibility of experience rests, and which remain as its underlying grounds, when everything empirical is abstracted from appearances. A concept which universally and adequately expresses such a formal and objective condition of experience would be entitled a pure concept of understanding. We are often told that Kant spoke to a crisis in the problem of knowledge. This is true, but not in the usual sense. The crisis was this: is knowledge possible without God? Philosophy was trying to eliminate the God concepts inherited from biblical theism, but not very successfully. The importance of Kant was that he gave a new answer to the problem. True knowledge was defined in terms which eliminated the old problem. God and all things in themselves were now irrelevant to man, whereas autonomous man was made totally relevant. Kant called his position transcendental philosophy because he held that man himself, by virtue of the universal rules of the autonomous mind, transcended himself. and man was able to escape the dilemma of verification of knowledge. Its advantage, quote, is due to the fact that it deals with concepts which have to relate to objects a priori, and the objective validity of which cannot therefore be demonstrated a posteriori, since that would mean the complete ignoring of their peculiar dignity. Kant thus turned philosophy upside down. Having freed the mind from God, Kant logically worked to free man's morality from God also. This meant affirming the autonomy of the will by means of the concept of freedom. Freedom was presupposed, and the word is Kant's, as a, quote, property of the will. The fundamental act of faith no longer has reference to God, but rather refers to man. As a result, the moral ought, the moral law, is now derived from man, not from God. The nature of moral issues was thus revolutionized by Kant. The generations which followed Kant may have been ignorant of his philosophy or even his name, but increasingly they reflected Kant's revolution. In a Stanford University sit-in Friday, April 18, 1969, one speaker was Paul Bernstein, graduate student in political science from New York City. Striking a dramatic pose, naked to the waist and bearded, Bernstein declared, "We should not keep talking about anything. We should look inward to ourselves. But it is not enough merely to look inward. The whole purpose of this movement has been not only to get us to look inward, to realize what our moral concerns are, but to call upon us not to sit with those moral concerns, but to take action so that we can still respect ourselves as human beings." What these Stanford students proudly believed was their young revolution was the tail end of an old revolutionary tradition which had a classic formulation in the hands of Immanuel Kant. "We should look inward to ourselves," Bernstein said, long before Kant wrote, "It is a priori morally necessary to produce the summum bonum by freedom of will." In The Science of Right, Kant therefore defined the right in terms of man's autonomy rather than God's nature. "Act externally in such a manner that the free exercise of thy will may be able to coexist with the freedom of all others, according to a universal law." Thus, when 20th century humanists defend the morality of any acts of perversion between consenting adults because no coercion is involved, they are reasoning from Kantian premises logically and consistently. Kant eliminated from philosophy a transcendental one and many. Autonomous man was now his own lord and universe. As a result, the one and the many had to be relocated in history. This relocation was not utopian. It had no reference to a future order, but rather represented an ostensibly present reality. History, therefore, progressively was to become a clash between atomistic, anarchistic man and the totalitarian state, two rival gods alike at war with the triune God and with each other. Descartes' autonomous man still needed the props of spiritual and material substances, and God as well, but Kant's autonomous man needed none of these things, and indeed found them more than irrelevant. They presented a problem to the new knowledge rather than a need. Truth for Descartes meant empirical science. Truth for the pragmatism of post-Kantian man is what works, that which satisfies. Truth defined by Scripture as God the Son now has come to mean the mind of man. The new one and many provided for post-Kantian man the principle of meaning.